Yo, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. So you can see over here on my right side, I have all of the Yu-Gi-Oh series. We're going to go ahead and actually do a tier list of the best series in Yu-Gi-Oh across all of the eras, so to speak. This is not necessarily going to be a video based off of the anime in terms of what my favorite season of Yu-Gi-Oh is in terms of the eras, but it's more so the gameplay, okay? So that's very important because we actually also have Yu-Gi-Oh! Zero, which actually had a bunch of different rules. This is back when we had the Bandai version of the game where Dark Magician was actually technically stronger than Blue Eyes because you would add the attack and defense kind of combined, but I will go over that as well. So let's go and just start off with the first one over here, which is Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s, okay? So S tier obviously being the best and F tier being the worst. I gotta say, starting off with the Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s, I want to say that in terms of having the rush duel mechanic, because that's basically what it is. Again, this is only strictly going over gameplay of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Series in terms of the era. Now, rush duel cards, I do want to admit, at first I was thinking about honestly putting this in the F tier, but I think legendary cards are kind of cool, and the reason why I like the mechanic of having a legendary card, it's kind of that is your ace monster, and I really wish that Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of capitalized off of this in terms of its actual gameplay design, but obviously with Yu-Gi-Oh! As fast as it is, you're gonna have to open up with it in order for it to even be relevant in the game. But I think having a legendary card, seeing all these iconic cards, that's the only thing that I feel holds this. The reason why I don't want to put this on the F tier is literally because of the legend card, and I think that that's a cool idea. But overall, in terms of the idea of Rush, it's basically just spam out cards. It was kind of made for the younger audience to maybe have an introduction to Yu-Gi-Oh! But at the end of the day, if you played Rush Duel, and it's very hard to even get a game here in the TCG or in the States to actually play Rush Duel, the thing with the actual gameplay mechanic is it's so incredibly simplified, and it really ruins Yu-Gi-Oh! Compared to the modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Where it's very complex. And I think that that's what makes Yu-Gi-Oh! Way cooler than a lot of these other games, is its idea of being able to explode turn one. You could do that in Rush Duel, however, the downsides with Rush Duel is you make something, then it gets ran over, and a lot of stuff is just recycled older stuff. At the end of the day, it's kind of cool to see some of the nostalgia cards, but some of these cards have completely changed. Some of them are kind of the exact same thing, but I still think that it has some kind of cool things with the legendary cards. So again, I'm going to put it in the D tier. Now, next up, we are going to actually talk about GX. Now, GX obviously had fusions. In terms of the era, if I want to consider it kind of it's kind of hard because it does have a lot of really cool mechanics for fusions. It didn't really stick with me personally. Again, this is kind of obviously any tier list that anyone sees is going to be subjective anyways. I think that in terms of fusions, we kind of had that earlier on. Obviously, they had way better fusions with the series as it progressed, but I still think that they didn't have as much of an impact as what I actually want to talk about next. While I do think that heroes being the main thing in GX, they weren't essentially going to be the S tier archetype, right? One thing that I really wanted to kind of compare it to, because it's kind of close by in terms of the release, is actually the best series, and that's what I want to talk about next. So I gotta put in the S tier, because when you compare it about fusion monsters kind of coming out in the game being a lot better in the GX era versus Synchro era, Synchro has completely redefined the whole game, because we had a lot of small monsters that would go into a powerful boss monster, and some of them would be kind of related to the archetype, specifically the Junk Warriors and stuff. That was really cool, and Synchros introduced some of the most powerful monsters that we had ever seen in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot of decks, their whole goal was just to make as many powerful Synchros, things like Thought Ruler Archfiend, which I know now doesn't see play. Stardust Dragon at the time was super cool, and I think 5Ds was by far one of the best eras. We had Lightsworn kind of come out in Light of Destruction in that era. I think Synchros really were one of the coolest things in the sense we had the 5Ds. They were the 5 power monsters. Now I know Red Dragon Archfiend wasn't really there. Pretty much it came down to Stardust Dragon, and Ancient Fairy was still a very powerful card at the time as well, because being able to get those field spells was really good for a lot of archetypes. So I feel Synchros hold a special place for not only me, but for a lot of people that played Yu-Gi-Oh! Because we had Plant Synchro that eventually kind of came out with this, Synchro decks in general, because it kind of made it so Yu-Gi-Oh! Was more of a game, I would say, where it wasn't necessarily super archetype dependent. When we look at Teledad, what archetype was that? Was that kind of mixing in heroes? It was just mixing in a lot of stuff that worked well, and I think this was the peak of Yu-Gi-Oh! When you compare it to fusions in GX, which I'll touch upon, it's not even close in terms of like the creativity that was involved in the decks that were like synchro decks. Like I'm talking about like Jeff Jones' innovation, just toolbox decks in general always were the coolest thing versus playing a specific archetype, in my personal opinion, because it was more so about the duelist versus like, oh, you just take a Salad Great deck and you take all the good Salad Great cards and you put them together. This was really cool to see, like just so many decks emerging out of this era, and even kind of leading into the Zexal era where we had other things come out into the game that kind of had some toolbox functionality, but this is more so like where we had like introduction to like Zenmaines, Levier, Rescue Rabbit. I think Zexal, in terms of the XYZ monsters, really did shape up the game. Now, for whatever reason, a lot of people always ask me this question of like, what's my favorite series in the anime? Apparently, Zexal wasn't the greatest, and again, this is not an anime tier list. This is specifically going over what I feel like was my favorite in terms of a tier list, in terms of like, again, card gameplay. XYZ monsters, I actually think are pretty cool. I remember when a lot of people first saw XYZ, they were like, dude, this is the end of Yu-Gi-Oh! Or it was the same thing when Pendulum came out, and then when Lynx came out as well. People were like, I'm quitting this game because like, they ruined my favorite deck or whatever. I think the idea of having cards attached to it as kind of ammo, as material, was a pretty cool and innovative way to play the game. And I also want to give this one over here a relatively decent rating, because again, Rescue Rabbit pretty much defined the game. I would say it's anywhere from like A and B tier. I'm gonna go ahead and just put it in the B tier so we have a little bit of separation, but I still think that Zexal, in terms of having XYZ monsters, were kind of cool. And then we had like the whole idea of ranking up. This was a pretty cool gameplay mechanic, and I would say that earlier introductions to specifically like we had wind-ups being very powerful in that era. Also in kind of the same era, we had the Insectors. Those were really powerful. Those ended up winning lots and lots of tournaments. I still think that the mechanic of XYZ monsters is kind of the coolest thing that we've seen in a really long time. I think it beats out on Pen and Link monsters. It got a little bit confusing, but I like the idea of how you would basically make these Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Let's go ahead and skip on to the next duel, so we don't have any dead space, so to speak, in this video. So we'll go ahead and spectate another like higher ranked game. This is supposed to be a 1000 plus. Okay, let's go ahead and hit enter. So we want those high ranked duels over here. All right, so what are we watching right here? All right, there's some XYZ stuff. AA Zeus even. I know that came out way later in terms of like the timeline, but again, if we're going over like the XYZ monster mechanics, I think that they were actually pretty cool. So next up, since I mentioned a lot of like relatively positive stuff about Zexal, again, XYZ era is what we're mainly talking about here. I want to go into the older section over here because I see this one over here. So season 1 of Yu-Gi-Oh, and it actually ties into season 0, and like I don't really want to talk too much about the anime because this one never really had an official really good card game, because a lot of stuff was just kind of like earlier printings, but I think some of the ideas that they had weren't actually that bad. A lot of the stuff in the Bandai stuff, a lot of people had never really seen before, but it was kind of cool how the attack and defense would be added up together. And a lot of times when you look at like some of the season 0, some of the stuff wasn't even card game related. If any of you guys want to watch on YouTube, maybe we should do a series on talking about some of like the crazier things that have gone in Yu-Gi-Oh. I actually really liked Season 0, but again, it's not really something that most people have actually experienced, and I actually want to reserve this maybe for a topic that's going to be completely separate in another future video, and that is because it requires so much like knowledge, and some of the stuff doesn't really make too much sense because it's kind of mostly from the anime, as far as I'm aware of, because I didn't physically play in the Bandai version. I don't think most people actually even played that version of the game, as it really wasn't like popularized or even released here in the States, as far as I'm aware of, but it's still pretty cool, but this deserves a dedicated video, and I'm going to actually put Season 1 over here in the A tier. A lot of people like to think old school Yu-Gi-Oh is my favorite for whatever reason, because in a sense, I've talked about how Yu-Gi-Oh was way better in the past, and I'm not even talking about the like earlier stages like Season 1 where you would summon Jinzo and that was powerful back in the day when people would always run like Magic Cylinder. This is mostly like playing at lunch during school, or like you had a couple friends that played Yu-Gi-Oh and you guys were using rubber bands to wrap your cards. It's still a very special place, but I still think that 5Ds is the peak of Yu-Gi-Oh. When you look and look at like Google Trends and stuff, this one's actually still the most popular across most people, but for some reason the nostalgia still is pretty heavy with specifically Blue Eyes and Dark Magician. People still really like that, but I actually grew up on specifically the Game Boy Advance game for Yu-Gi-Oh! The Eternal Duelist Soul, which is still basically in Season 1 of like Yu-Gi-Oh! Era in terms of like when it was like popularized. And I think that this is a lot of people's favorite. Let's go ahead and spectate another duel over here. But I'm also curious to know how you guys feel about Season 1 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically, because a lot of people always think for some reason that that one is my all-time favorite, because I talk about how Yu-Gi-Oh! Again was way better back in the day, and it doesn't really come down to the combos being super OP like, you know, nowadays in Yu-Gi-Oh! Everything is all about one card set up 10 negates and then your opponent cannot play. While you could kind of do that in theory with the Synchro era, even when we look at like when we had Plant Synchro and then like you'd make a pretty decent board and then you'd follow up with a Max C, which would kind of be a GG essentially. I still think that there was still more play in this era Yu-Gi-Oh! Versus 5Ds, but 5Ds, it's still, to me, is peak Yu-Gi-Oh! But I like the old school Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot as well, and the reason why is because the plays were relatively simple, and when your opponent would make something that was good, to be like, I summon this card, and you equip it with Axe of Despair, and you're like, okay, I gotta get rid of this one monster. Versus nowadays in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's like, oh, he's got like 10 different monsters or 5 different monsters that all have good effects, and I have to defeat him using, you know, these cards, and he has so many cards that just stop me, I can't even play. And that didn't really happen back in the day with Yu-Gi-Oh! Sometimes people would make maybe Jinzo or Horus, and you'd be locked out of like, you know, I can't play any traps, or I can't play any spells, or I'm not going to be able to use my monster effect because he has like Warrior from another planet. This still is a really good era of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think a lot of people will put this on their S tier, but I still want to separate the S tier category. Again, 5Ds is peak Yu-Gi-Oh! Alright, so we got 2 more left here, and next up I want to talk about re-range, specifically Link monsters. So earlier on, I would have said that the Link era, because this is really where Yu-Gi-Oh! Just went into warp drive, I would say, for the speed. So when it first initially came out, there's a lot of different decks that did not even function, and I would honestly have put it at C tier, because it definitely ruined decks. Now, if we're talking about like the era of Yu-Gi-Oh!, because the game did evolve, remember, back in the day, you could not put a fusion monster just, you know, in anywhere except for like the extra monster zone, unless you of course had the Link arrows that would point to it. And I think a lot of people hated Yu-Gi-Oh! When that announcement got made, and a lot of people said they just did it for a monetary reason, as in like, okay, well, your favorite deck is like something like Karakuri, which legitimately could not function before they started making other better support for the deck, because you could not have these zones, right? And so originally I would have put it down here, but there are a lot of really cool Link monsters that come into the game, whether it be all the charmers to really support a lot of legacy stuff. And if we look at the amount of support that we got for legacy stuff, heck, we just got Volcanics, and that's pretty cool as well, because that's kind of, I guess, where we're in terms of the era, because 7s doesn't really count because it's not modern Yu-Gi-Oh! So we're still getting a lot of like Link stuff for older archetypes, and I think that is kind of cool to make a little bit more things viable. So I kind of want to put in like the B/C tier, because after we got the update where we can make fusion monsters and we can make synchro monsters, I would say it was a little bit better. But this is really where I feel a lot of people dropped off Yu-Gi-Oh! In terms of like reading comments. People are like, dude, Link monsters ruined the game. I would say that like it's anywhere from B to C tier for me. In terms of like Link monsters, and the reason why is because there's so many Link monsters that like you don't just make a Link monster, right, and then you end your turn, right? Firewall Pass was a meme, but I still think that in terms of its gameplay design, it really made turns go on way too long, because you would make this Link monster and then you would link it with this monster and to gain some sort of bonus effect, and it just made the duels last a little bit longer. Or from the perspective of a player that maybe isn't super competitive, I would say the era of Links just made the turns last way too long, which is kind of like a problem, I would say, in Yu-Gi-Oh! That definitely does exist nowadays in the game. So that's just how I kind of feel about like Link monsters. Now we're going into Pend. Okay, so I felt like the Pendulum mechanic, and I've talked to a lot of people that have topped multiple, tournaments, and I actually worked with a lot of sponsors. And a lot of sponsors were actually trying to get me to promote Dragon Ball Z and other card games, and they're like, you know, after specifically the Pend era, when it first came out, the mechanic before we got the specific zones that would actually block off, like nowadays with Pendulum, it blocks off. The whole idea of Pend was to really show off the power, and it felt very unfair to be like, I place these 2 cards, summon all these monsters, and I just bring them back the next turn. It was one of the most like, what the heck is this? And in terms of playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, I mean, I reached legitimately top 10 playing Klee, and that deck took very little skill to play. I mean, all I did was make towers, and I was just winning back to back to back. It was the easiest thing, and I felt like that was really unfair. I mean, nowadays with Pendulum, you have to have a Link monster if you want to go ahead and pen from non-hand zones. But I think in terms of pen, it's pretty like mediocre right now, at least as far as I'm aware of in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's because it requires these zones, and you can lock out the zones, you can imperm. There's a lot more stuff that you can do because before they had those dedicated zones, and that's really where I felt like Yu-Gi-Oh just went way too out of control in terms of power when you compare a pen deck that could just have everything be destroyed, and then you just slap it next turn. At that point, I put like the F tier because it was just really, really no fun for the person to be on the receiving end of that mechanic. However, through time, they have changed it, and obviously now it's updated, where we have these zones dedicated, which actually kind of nerfs Pendulum in a relatively big sense, because you can literally just knock out one of the zones, and then your opponent can't really play with cards like Imperm, which is right here up on the duel. So I would say these changes were quite nice, and obviously, at some point, we had like the field spell change. I don't remember what era that was in. Was that in Pen era, where we had the thing where both people can use field spells? But in terms of the Pendulum mechanic, it was another mechanic also where I want to say kind of falls in the same lines as V-Rains, where it just made turns take too long, because it was never complete pen scale and then summon all the monsters from your hand and pass. It was no, this Pendulum monster searches this Pendulum monster, this searches this Pendulum. It just got on and on. It's like the Yu-Gi-Oh meme of the turns never ending. And I feel like that is one reason, same thing with Links, is the reason why Master Duel is set up in the way that it is, where it's basically set up so the players that are kind of newer to the game, like recently I was watching a live stream of Soldier Boy playing, and he was like just completely lost with some of these newer cards, because it's not easy to follow Pendulum at all, because like you look at the cards, right, and they just have so many effects, like, and even though we did get that change where we have it where like they can only summon the monsters from the extra deck that are face up, if you happen to have the link zones, because before you could just keep on summoning them again and again. Even though that was a kind of a nice change, I would never put it anywhere near like the top of Yu-Gi-Oh as far as like the pen era of Yu-Gi-Oh. And it's hard to say if it's like in the same area as V-Rains or even worse, because if we're looking at it like earlier on, I would say that it was worse, but it's almost on the same level. Now that I'm looking at this list, I'm like, hey, GX not looking too bad. You know what? We're gonna move both of these down, and the reason why I'm gonna move both of these down now that I'm thinking about it is because if we look at the fresh blood that comes into Yu-Gi-Oh, I'm talking about the newer players. Is it younger audiences? Not really, right? It's mostly people that have, played the game and then now they kind of just want to come back, or they have a lot of free time, because Yu-Gi-Oh, it's like another full-time job. You got to be keeping up with every single Yu-Gi-Oh set, and you have to know all these new effects. But the main thing that I want to separate this like tier list from, even though Synchros can go on for a little bit in terms of combos, it's not even close to like the Link era and the Panda era of the turns just taking way too long. So there it is, guys. That's my tier list. I'm curious to know what you think. Would you guys move any of these? What would you have changed specifically? I know I didn't touch upon Yu-Gi-Oh! Season 0 much, because that's kind of something that I want to reserve one video for, because otherwise this video will be an hour long, because Season 0 of Yu-Gi-Oh! It didn't really make too much sense in terms of like the rules. I mean, they kind of made it up as they were going on, to be honest, but you've seen things in the anime with like Mammoth Graveyard, the Bone Tower falling down. Like some of the stuff just doesn't really make any sense. And because Season 0, I don't know if it really had like a very large player base. We'll dedicate a video towards it, but that's my tier list. Let me know your thoughts on it. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like on it. If you're new here, hit subscribe, turn the bell if you want to see more Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier lists that are a little bit different than the normal videos. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.